While the London Company was planting its colony on the James River, the Plymouth Company sought to retrieve its failure on the Kennebec. In 1614, Captain John Smith, who had returned to England from Jamestown, was sent over with 2 ships to explore. He made a map of the coast from Maine to Cape Cod, and called the country New England. The next year Smith led out a colony, but a French fleet took him prisoner, no settlement was made, and 5 years passed before the first permanent English colony was planted in the Plymouth Company's grant by the Separatists. To understand who these people were, it must be remembered that during the reign of Queen Elizabeth the Protestant Episcopal Church was the established Church of England, and that severe laws were passed to force all the people to attend its services. But a sect arose which wished to purify the Church by abolishing certain forms and ceremonies. These people were called Puritans, and were divided into 2 sects. Group 1 was those Puritans who wished to purify the Church of England while they remained members of it. Second group was the Independents, or Separatists, who wished to separate from that church and worship God in their own way. The Separatists were cruelly persecuted during Queen Elizabeth's reign and afterward. One band of them fled to Holland in 1608, where they found peace. But time passed and it became necessary for them to decide whether they should stay in Holland and become Dutch, or find a home in some land where they might continue to remain Englishmen. They decided to leave Holland, formed a company, and finally obtained leave from the London Company to settle near the mouth of the Delaware River. Voyage of the Mayflower, led by Brewster, Bradford, and Standish, a party of pilgrims sailed from Holland in July 1620, and the ship Speedwell were joined in England by a party from London in the Mayflower, and in August both vessels put to sea. But the Speedwell proved unseaworthy, and all put back to Plymouth in England, where some gave up the voyage. 102 held fast to their purpose, and in September set sail in the Mayflower. The voyage was long and stormy, and November came before they sighted a sandy coast far to the northeastward of the Delaware. For a while they strove hard to go southward, but adverse winds drove them back, and they dropped anchor in Cape Cod Bay. The land here was within the territory of the Plymouth Company. The Pilgrims, however, decided to stay and get leave to settle, but this decision displeased some of them. A meeting, therefore, was held in the ship's cabin, November 21, 1620, and the Mayflower Compact, binding all who signed it to obey such government as might be established, was drawn up and signed by 41 of the 65 men on the vessel. This done, the work of choosing a site for their homes began, and for several weeks little parties explored the coast before one of them entered a harbor and selected a spot which John Smith had named Plymouth. To this harbor the Mayflower was brought, and while the men were busy putting up rude cabins, the women and children remained on the ship. The first winter was a dreadful one. The Pilgrims lived in crowded quarters, and the effects of the voyage and the severity of the winter sent half of them to their graves before spring. But the rest never faltered, and when the Mayflower returned to England in April, not one of the colonists went back in her. By the end of the first summer a fort had been built on a hill, 7 houses had been erected along a village street leading down from the fort to the harbor, 26 acres had been cleared, and a bountiful harvest had been gathered. Other pilgrims came over, the neighboring Indians kept the peace, and the colony was soon prosperous. As soon as the colony was planted, steps were taken to buy the land on which it stood. The old Plymouth Company, organized in 1606, was succeeded in 1620 by a new corporation called the Council for New England, which received a grant of all the land in America between 40 degrees and 48 degrees of north latitude. From this Council for New England, therefore, the Pilgrims bought as much land as they needed. The king, however, refused to give them a charter, so the people of Plymouth, or the Old Colony as it came to be called, managed their own affairs in their own way for 70 years. At first the men assembled in town meeting, made laws, and elected officers. But when the growth of the colony made such meetings unwieldy, representative government was set up, and each settlement sent 2 delegates to an assembly. Shortly after 1620, attempts were made to plant other colonies in New England. Most of them failed, but some of the colonists made a settlement called Naumkeag. Among those who watched these attempts with great interest was John White, a Puritan rector in England. He believed that the time had come for the Puritans to do what the Separatists had done. The quarrel between the king and the Puritans was then becoming serious, and the time seemed at hand when men who wished to worship God according to their conscience would have to seek a home in America. White accordingly began to urge the planting of a Puritan colony in New England. So well did he succeed that an association was formed, a great tract of land was obtained from the Council for New England. And in 1628 60 men, led by John Endicott, settled at Naumkeag and changed its name to Salem, which means peace. The members of the association next secured from King Charles I a charter which made them a corporation, called this corporation the Governor and Company of Massachusetts Bay in New England, and gave it the right to govern colonies planted on its lands. More settlers with a great herd of cattle were now hurried to Salem, which thus became the largest colony in New England. The same year, 1629, that the charter was obtained, 12 leading Puritans signed an agreement to head an emigration to Massachusetts, provided the charter and government of the company were removed to New England. One of the signers was John Winthrop, and by him in 1630 nearly 1,000 Puritans were led to Salem. Thence they soon removed to a little 3-hilled peninsula where they founded the town of Boston. More immigrants followed, and before the end of 1630 17 ships with nearly 1,500 Puritans reached Massachusetts. They settled at Boston, Charlestown, Roxbury, Dorchester, Watertown, and Cambridge. The charter was brought with them, the meetings of the company were now held in the colony, and so many of the colonists became members of the company that Massachusetts was practically self-governing. Before long a representative government was established in the colony, each town electing members of a legislature called the General Court. Every town also had its local government carried on by town meetings, but only church members were allowed to vote. About 2 years after the founding of Plymouth, the Council for New England granted to John Mason and Sir Ferdinando Gorges a large tract of land between the rivers Merrimack and Kennebec. In it 2 settlements, now known as Portsmouth and Dover, were planted, 1623, on the Piscataqua River, and some fishing stations on the coast farther north. In 1629 the province was divided. Mason obtained a patent, or deed, for the country between the Merrimack and the Piscataqua, and named it New Hampshire. Gorges received the country between the Piscataqua and the Kennebec, which was called Maine. The towns on the Piscataqua were small fishing and fur trading stations, and after Mason died, 1635, they were left to look out for themselves. With 2 other New Hampshire towns, Exeter and Hampton, they became almost independent republics. They set up their own governments, made their own laws, and owed allegiance to nobody save the king. Massachusetts, however, claimed as her north boundary an east and west line 3 miles north of the source of the Merrimack River. She therefore soon annexed the 4 New Hampshire towns and gave them representation in her legislature. If the claim of Massachusetts was valid in the case of the New Hampshire towns, it was equally so for those of Maine. But it was not till 1652, after Gorges was dead and the settlers in Maine, at York, Wells, and Kittery, had set up a government of their own, that these towns were brought under her authority. Later, 1677, Massachusetts bought up the claim of the heirs of Gorges, and came into possession of the whole province. Among those who came to Salem in the early days of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a Puritan minister named Roger Williams. But he had not been long in the colony when he said things which angered the rulers. He held that all religions should be tolerated, that all laws requiring attendance at church should be repealed, that the land belonged to the Indians and not to the king, and that the settlers ought to buy it from the Indians and not from the king. For these and other sayings Williams was ordered back to England. But he fled to the woods, lived with the Indians for a winter, and in the following summer founded Providence, 1636. And now another disturber appeared in Boston in the person of Anne Hutchinson, and in a little while she and her followers were driven away. Some of them went to New Hampshire and founded Exeter, while others with Anne herself went to Rhode Island in Narragansett Bay, and founded Portsmouth and Newport. For a time each of the little towns, Providence, Portsmouth, and Newport, arranged its own affairs in its own way. But in 1643 Williams obtained from the English Parliament a charter which united them under the name of the Incorporation of Providence Plantations on the Narragansett Bay in New England. Religious troubles did not end with the banishment of Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Many persons objected to the law forbidding any but church members to vote or hold office. So in 1635 and 1636, numbers of people led by Thomas Hooker and others went out from Dorchester, Watertown, and Cambridge and founded Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford in the Connecticut River Valley. Later a party from Roxbury settled at Springfield. For a while these four towns were part of Massachusetts. But in 1639 Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield adopted a constitution and founded a republic which they called Connecticut. As the quarrel between the Puritans and the king was by this time very bitter, the Puritans continued to come to New England in large numbers. Some of them made settlements on Long Island Sound. A large band under John Davenport founded New Haven, 1638. Next, in 1639, Milford and Guilford were started, and then, in 1640, Stamford. In 1643 the four towns joined in a sort of union and took the name New Haven Colony. Thus there were planted in New England between 1620 and 1643 5 distinct colonies, namely, 1. Plymouth, or the Old Colony, 2nd. Massachusetts Bay Colony, 3rd. Rhode Island, or Providence Plantations, 4th. Connecticut, and 5th. The New Haven Colony. In 1643 4 of them Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Haven united for defense against the Indians and the Dutch, and called their league the United Colonies of New England. This confederation maintained a successful existence for 41 years. When the New England Confederation was formed, the king and the Puritans in Old England had come to blows, and civil war was raging there. During the next 20 years no more English colonies were planted in America. War at once stopped the stream of immigrants. The Puritans in England remained to fight the king, and numbers went back from New England to join the Parliamentary Army. For the next 15 years population in New England increased slowly. Life in the New England colonies was very unlike that in Virginia. People dwelt in villages, cultivated small farms, and were largely engaged in trade and commerce. They bartered corn and peas, woolen cloth, and wampum with the Indians for beaver skins, which they sent to England to pay for articles bought from the mother country. They salted cod, dried aloes and bass, made boards and staves for hogsheads, and sent all these to the West Indies to be exchanged for sugar, molasses, and other products of the tropics. They built ships in the seaports where lumber was cheap and sold them abroad. They traded with Spain and Portugal, England, the Netherlands, and Virginia. The colonists brought little money with them, and much of what they brought went back to England to pay for supplies. Buying and trading in New England, therefore, had to be done largely without gold or silver. Beaver skins and wampum, bushels of corn, produce, cattle, and even bullets were used as money and passed at rates fixed by law. In the hope of remedying the scarcity of money, the government of Massachusetts ordered that a mint should be set up, and in 1652 Spanish silver brought from the West Indies was melted and coined into pine tree currency. That less gold and silver might go abroad for supplies, home manufacturers were encouraged by gifts of money, by exemptions of property from taxation, and by excusing workmen from military duty. The cultivation of flax was encouraged. Children were taught to spin and weave, and glass works, salt works, and iron furnaces were started. On the farms, utensils and furniture were generally made in the household. Almost everything was made of wood, as spoons, tankards, pails, firkins, hinges for cupboard and closet doors, latches, plows, and harrows. Every boy learned to use his jackknife, and could make brooms from birch trees, bowls and dippers and bottles from gourds, and butter paddles from red cherry. The women made soap and candles, carded wool, spun, wove, bleached or dyed the linen and woolen cloth, and made the garments for the family. They knit mittens and stockings, made straw hats and baskets, and plucked the feathers from live geese for beds and pillows. On the farms, the houses of the early settlers were of logs, or were framed structures covered with shingles or clapboards. The tables, chairs, stools, and bedsteads were of the plainest sort, and were often made of puncheons, that is, of small tree trunks split in half. Sometimes the table would be a long board laid across two X supports. This was the board, around which the family sat at meals. In the better houses in the towns, the furniture was of course very much finer. The center of village life was the meeting house, or church. Nearby was the house of the minister, the inn or tavern, and the dwellings of the inhabitants. In early times, if the village was on the frontier or exposed to Indian attack, it was guarded by blockhouses surrounded by a high stockade. These garrison houses, as they were called, were of stone or logs, with the second story projecting over the first, and had loopholes in place of windows. Most of them have long since disappeared, but a few still remain, turned into dwellings. Sometimes there were 3 or more blockhouses in a village, and to these, when the Indians were troublesome, the farmers and their families came each night to sleep. Among the acts passed by the General Court of Massachusetts in early days were several in regard to education. In 1636 £400 was voted for a public school. 2 years later, John Harvard, a former minister, left his library and half his fortune to this school, and in grateful remembrance it was called Harvard College. Thus started, the good work went on. Parents and masters were by law compelled to teach their children and apprentices to read English, know the important laws, and repeat the Orthodox Catechism. Another law required every town of 50 families to maintain a school for at least 6 months a year, and every town of 200 householders a primary and a grammar school, wherein Latin should be taught. Though the Puritans suffered persecution in the Old World, they had not learned to be tolerant. As we have seen, no man could vote in Massachusetts who was not a member of their church. They drove out Roger Williams and Hutchinson, and again, in later times, banished or fined, imprisoned, and flogged men and women who wished to worship God in their own way. When 2 Quaker women arrived, 1656, they were sent away and a sharp law was made against their sect. But in spite of all persecution, the Quakers kept coming. At last, in 1659-61, 3 men and a woman were hanged on Boston Common because they returned after having once been banished. Plymouth and Connecticut also enacted laws against the Quakers. By this time, the days of Puritan rule in Old England were over. In 1660, King Charles II was placed upon the throne of his father. Connecticut promptly acknowledged him as king, and sent her governor, the younger John Winthrop, to London to obtain a charter. He easily secured one, in 1662, which spread the authority of Connecticut over the New Haven colony, gave her a domain stretching across the continent to the Pacific, and established a government so liberal that the charter was kept in force till 1818. New Haven colony for a time resisted, but one by one the towns which formed the colony acknowledged the authority of Connecticut. Rhode Island, likewise, proclaimed the king and sought a new charter. When obtained, in 1663, it defined her boundaries and provided for a form of government quite as liberal as that of Connecticut. It remained in force 179 years. From 1640 to 1660, the English colonies in America had been left much to themselves. No new colonies had been founded, and the old ones had managed their own affairs in their own way. But with Charles II, a new era opens. Several new colonies were soon established, and though Rhode Island and Connecticut received liberal charters, all the colonies were soon to feel the king's control. As we shall see in next videos, Massachusetts was deprived of her charter, but after a few years she received a new one, 1691, which united the Plymouth Colony, Massachusetts, and Maine in the one colony of Massachusetts Bay. New Hampshire, however, was made a separate royal province.